It was mid-October when I decided to get away from everything. The stress from work had built up to the point where I couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes without feeling overwhelmed. I needed to disconnect. So, I rented a small cabin in the woods, about 3 hours from my hometown. The kind of cabin you only hear about in old stories, the ones where you're truly isolated. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just nature and quiet. The perfect place to clear my mind. The drive there was peaceful at first. The trees, starting to show the vibrant colors of fall, lined the winding road, their branches stretching out like arms, trying to touch each other across the asphalt. The air was fresh, and the temperature was just cool enough to roll the windows down. I was looking forward to the solitude, the quiet. I was 28, and I'd never really experienced complete isolation before. This trip was supposed to be my reset. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The place was exactly as described. A small, one-story wooden structure with a stone fireplace and a wraparound porch. It sat on the edge of a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. The only sounds I could hear were the rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call in the distance. I stepped out of the car, breathing in the crisp air, and felt a sense of calm wash over me. This was what I needed. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The cabin smelled of pine wood and something else I couldn't quite place, like old books, mixed with the scent of damp earth. It was cozy, with a few mismatched chairs around a wooden table, a well-worn rug in the center, and a stone fireplace that looked like it had been used for many winters. The kitchen was small but functional, with a gas stove and an old fridge that hummed quietly in the corner. The place had character. I set my bags down on the bed, which was covered with a faded quilt, and opened the small window beside it. Outside, the woods seemed to go on forever. There was no one for miles, and the closest town was an hour away. The perfect escape. I felt a little buzz of excitement, knowing that for the next few days, I wouldn't have to worry about anything. After unpacking, I decided to make a fire. It took a bit of effort, but soon the flames were crackling, and the warmth filled the cabin. I sat in a chair by the fire with a mug of coffee and just listened to the sounds of the woods outside. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. The silence was thick, and every so often, I thought I heard something move outside. At first, I assumed it was just animals, squirrels or deer, but something about it felt different. I brushed it off as my imagination, settling deeper into the chair. I wasn't used to being so alone. The first night passed without incident. I woke up a few times, the shadows in the room unfamiliar, but nothing seemed out of place. The wind howled through the trees, and the cabin creaked as if it was settling into its own bones. I reminded myself that these were just the sounds of an old building and the surrounding wilderness. It was easy to forget that the world outside was so vast and untamed when all I had was the warmth of the fire and the soft, comforting noises of the night. The next morning, I woke up early, the sunlight streaming through the trees outside. I stretched, feeling the weight of the last few weeks slowly lift from my shoulders. It felt good to not have to rush anywhere, to not have a schedule to follow. After a quick breakfast, I decided to take a walk through the woods. The air was crisp and fresh, and the path was well-worn but not overly trafficked. The leaves crunched under my boots as I walked, the forest enveloping me in its quiet. I could feel the absence of civilization in a way I hadn't anticipated. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. The path began to feel less natural, like it had been altered in some way. The trees around me grew thicker, their trunks gnarled and twisted, casting long shadows across the ground. There were no animal sounds here, no chirping birds or rustling leaves. It was too quiet. I stopped walking, listening, trying to figure out what was wrong. But the more I stood there, the more I felt like I was being watched. It was a bizarre sensation. I shook it off and decided to turn back. As I retraced my steps, I noticed something odd, a footprint. It was large, and it seemed to have been made recently, the dirt still slightly disturbed. I crouched down to get a closer look. It wasn't the kind of print I was used to seeing in the woods. No bear or deer tracks, just a large, round indentation in the earth, almost like a boot print but too big for any boot I'd ever seen. I stood up quickly, a feeling of unease creeping up my spine. I hadn't noticed when it had gotten so quiet again, but now the silence seemed louder than before. I hurried back to the cabin, my heart starting to race. When I arrived, I locked the door behind me, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I was in a cabin in the middle of the woods. Of course, I was going to get jumpy. But something told me it wasn't just that. That afternoon, I spent some time reading in front of the fire. I kept my phone turned off, and for a while, I almost forgot about the strange feeling in the woods. But as night fell, the unease returned. The shadows outside seemed darker, deeper, and the wind had picked up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Someone was outside. The faint crunch of footsteps on the leaves, soft but distinct. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped, and I sat in the dark, waiting, my heart pounding in my chest. Then it started again, closer this time. The steps were slow, deliberate, as if whoever it was knew I was awake. I didn't know what to do. I considered grabbing a weapon, but I didn't have anything nearby. The fireplace poker was too far away. I silently moved to the window and peered out through the small gap between the curtains. But there was nothing. The clearing outside was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I stayed up for the rest of the night, listening for any sounds. Every little creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, made my heart skip a beat. But as the hours passed, nothing happened. The footsteps, if they had been real, had stopped. By morning, I had convinced myself that I had imagined it. I hadn't slept, but I had to leave the cabin. I had to get out. I packed my things quickly, barely taking the time to double-check the cabin. As I walked out onto the porch, I glanced around one last time. The woods were still quiet. But then, just as I was about to get into my car, I noticed something. The same footprint from yesterday was just outside the door. But now there were more, dozens of them. They circled the cabin, leading into the trees and then disappearing. They were fresh, the edges still sharp. I didn't hesitate. I got in my car and drove off, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I didn't look back. I was 34 when I decided to take some time off work. I'd been working long weeks for over a year straight, deadlines, meetings, constant emails. It was in early October, just before the heavy snows would usually start in the upper parts of Oregon. My mind was fried from city noise, the constant buzz of traffic and sirens. I needed a break. I didn't want a resort or some popular Airbnb spot. I wanted total silence, real distance from everything. No cell service, no people, just quiet. I wanted to feel far from it all. After looking around on some lesser-known forums and listings, I found a privately owned cabin that an older couple rented out just outside of a place called Granite Ridge, around 5,200 feet up in the Blue Mountains. It wasn't anything fancy, just a 2-room wooden structure with no electricity and a small wood stove. There was a creek nearby, a decent view of the slope, and it was surrounded by thick forest. The listing was honest. No internet, no phone signal, no nearby stores, nothing for about 20 miles. Just pure isolation. That's exactly what I wanted. I brought a few things. A week's worth of freeze-dried meals, bottled water, firewood. Even though the cabin had its own stash, a small gas stove, 2 power banks, a heavy-duty flashlight, a camp axe, a compass, a waterproof map of the area, and a journal. I packed all of it into the back of my Subaru and made the drive from Portland in about 6 hours, hitting the gravel forest road just after noon. The trees were already turning yellow and red. It was cold enough for breath to show in the morning, but warm enough to hike without a coat during the day. Perfect. I arrived at the cabin around 3:30 in the afternoon. It sat back off the narrow trail, hidden pretty well by trees. There was a small clearing with a rusty metal fire pit, a pile of stacked wood, and a log bench. The cabin itself looked solid, weathered, sure, but not falling apart. 2 small windows, one on the front and one on the side, both with wooden shutters. No locks on the doors. Just a heavy latch and a thick wooden beam you could drop across the inside if you wanted to feel secure. Inside, it was cozy. A cot with a thick sleeping bag, shelves with some canned food, matches, candles, a cast iron pan, a water jug, and a little journal where previous guests had written short notes. I skimmed a few of the entries, mostly people thanking the owners, talking about the peace and quiet, a few funny comments about mice. Nothing strange. I unpacked, lit a small fire in the stove to warm the room, and made some instant coffee. That first night was the kind of silence I hadn't heard in years. No humming appliances, no car doors, no voices. Just the creak of the trees outside when the wind picked up. I fell asleep early, probably around 8:30, and didn't wake up once until the sun came through the shutter cracks the next morning. The next couple of days were everything I'd hoped for. I hiked around the ridge, took notes in my journal, read a paperback I'd brought. On the third day, I hiked out a little farther, down into a lower valley. I followed the creek, looking for signs of elk or deer. I brought my compass and marked a few trees with chalk to keep track of where I'd come from. I didn't see any animals, but I found what looked like an old fence line, half-buried posts, rusted wire. It looked like someone had tried to fence off an area a long time ago. The trees there were a little younger, like maybe there'd been some kind of clearing that had since grown back in. There were some boot prints around the edge of the creek, but they looked old. The ground was dry enough that nothing fresh would have stayed long, but it still caught my attention. They weren't mine. They were from a heavy tread, maybe work boots, not hiking shoes, probably hunters or someone who'd been through before me. I went back to the cabin around 4 p.m., started a fire, and made some soup. It was starting to get colder. I sat outside for a while, just watching the sun drop behind the ridge. That's when I noticed something weird. I always kept my gear organized in the cabin, just the way I packed it. Flashlight on the right side of the shelf. Batteries in the red pouch. My knife handle turned facing out. That night, when I went to get my flashlight, it wasn't where I'd left it. It was in the middle of the shelf, sitting on top of the pouch instead of next to it. I paused, stared at it, tried to think if I'd moved it and forgot, but I was pretty sure I hadn't. I'd only used it the night before, and I remembered setting it back exactly where it belonged. I didn't panic, just chalked it up to forgetfulness, but it bothered me enough that I checked the door latch. Still locked from the inside. No signs anyone had been in. Still, I moved my gear into a duffel bag and set it right next to my cot that night. I left the axe near the door, just in case. I slept with the wooden beam locked in place. The next morning, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I chopped a little wood, filled up my water containers, and read most of the day. Around 2 p.m., I walked a short loop around the cabin, maybe a half-mile radius, just to get my blood moving. That's when I saw something that didn't make sense. About 200 feet from the cabin, uphill along the tree line, I saw what looked like a tin can sitting on the ground. It was an old stew can, the kind with the pull-tab top. I walked over and picked it up. No rust, barely any dirt. It had been opened recently. I didn't bring any canned stew. I only brought freeze-dried meals and a few tuna pouches. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. It had a tiny bit of food still crusted around the edges. Someone had been there. Recently, I made a wide loop back to the cabin, checking the brush for signs of movement. Nothing. No obvious tracks, no noises. I went back inside, shut the shutters, and started a fire even though it was still light out. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every little crack in the wood, every gust of wind outside made me flinch. I kept thinking about that can. I kept thinking about the prints near the creek. I stayed in the cot, flashlight in one hand, axe in the other. Around 3:30 in the morning, I heard what I thought was a branch snap outside. Just one. Not wind. Clean, dry snap. I didn't move, didn't breathe. It didn't happen again. The sun came up slow, but I was already packed by then. I decided I'd leave early, cut my week short by a day or two. I'd gotten what I needed out of the trip anyway. Some silence, some clarity. That was enough. But when I opened the door, I saw something that made my stomach turn. On the log bench just outside the cabin, there was a strip of cloth. Blue, dirty, frayed at the edges. It looked like the sleeve from a jacket. I didn't have anything blue. I hadn't seen any trash like that when I arrived. It hadn't been there the day before. I stared at it for maybe a full minute, trying to decide what to do. I thought about grabbing it and checking it closer, but something about it felt off, like I wasn't meant to see it, like it had been left there, deliberately. I didn't even eat breakfast. I stuffed everything into my backpack, doused the fire, and got in the car. I started driving back down the gravel road, going slower than I wanted because of the deep ruts. Every 100 feet or so, I checked my rearview mirror. There was nothing back there. No cars, no shapes, just the trees. It wasn't until I was almost 10 miles from the cabin that I saw the second thing that shook me. On the left side of the road, just inside the tree line, there was another can. Same brand, same kind of stew, sitting upright on a tree stump like it had been placed there. I didn't stop, didn't get out, just kept driving. I didn't tell anyone about it for a long time, not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't know how to explain it. Nothing actually happened. No one attacked me. I wasn't chased. I didn't find any bodies or weapons, but I knew someone had been out there, watching, close enough to move things inside the cabin, close enough to leave things behind. It wasn't until about a year later that I found a thread on a hiking forum about the Granite Ridge area. Someone had mentioned old hunting cabins. Someone else replied with a warning, said there were a few weird stories. Not about ghosts, not about monsters, just about people. Strange campers, people who didn't want company. A guy mentioned finding his firewood rearranged in the middle of the night. Another said he woke up and all the candles in his cabin had been taken. Nothing else, just the candles. I never went back. I deleted the cabin owner's contact information, threw away the map I'd used, burned the journal pages I'd written while I was there. That trip did clear my head, though, just not in the way I expected. I realized there are parts of the world where people live without rules. People who don't want to be found. People who notice when someone's close. And sometimes, if you're not paying attention, they let you know they've seen you. Sometimes that's the only warning you get. I was 31 the year I decided to disappear for a while. Not from anything dramatic, not from the law or someone chasing me. I was just tired. I'd worked construction for most of my 20s, long shifts under the sun, dealing with supervisors who barely remembered your name. My knees were giving out and my back felt older than my dad's. So when I got laid off in late spring of 2019, I didn't look for new work right away. I took it as a sign. I had a bit of money saved, not a lot, but enough to float for a few months if I lived cheap. A guy I knew, Rick, used to hunt in northern Wisconsin, and he told me about a place he'd stayed in, an old hunting cabin near Lackview Desert, barely an hour from the Michigan border. He said it was rustic, had no cell service, and nobody went near it after the snow melted because there wasn't much game around. It belonged to a friend of his uncle's or something. He said I could probably rent it for next to nothing if I called the owner directly. So I did. The guy didn't care much. He said if I wanted to give him $400 for the month and not burn it down, the key was under a cement frog by the door. So I packed up my old blue Tacoma with canned food, fishing gear, some tools, and a couple of paperbacks. I didn't bring a laptop. No internet. That was the point. I was going to go off the grid for a while. Just get away from all the noise. I drove up in early June. It took me almost 8 hours from my apartment in Madison. I'd never been that far north before, and the last hour of driving was nothing but trees. The paved roads turned into cracked gravel, and eventually into what felt like trails. I passed a few old houses that looked like no one had lived in them since the 90s. Faded mailboxes with names I couldn't pronounce, old trucks rusting into the earth. The cabin was farther out than I thought. It wasn't even marked. I had to turn off onto a trail that was barely wide enough for my truck. The trees were so close they brushed the sides as I drove in. When I finally got there, it was smaller than I expected. One story, maybe 20 feet wide. It had a screened porch out front and a metal chimney sticking up from the back like a bent finger. The woods around it were thick and alive. The kind of alive that's almost loud. Insects, birds, whined through leaves. I liked it immediately. I found the frog, got the key, and opened the door. The inside smelled like wood smoke and old leather. There was one big room with a stone fireplace, a dusty green couch, a table with 2 chairs, and a kitchen area with a propane stove and a dented fridge that didn't work. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a small bathroom with no mirror and a dry toilet I'd have to empty into a compost bin outside. There was a small window in the bedroom that looked out toward the woods behind the cabin. I set my bags down, cracked a beer, and sat on the porch. The only sounds were birds, the creak of trees, and the distant buzzing of bugs. No cars, no people. It was perfect. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my mornings fishing at a small stream I'd found about a half-mile from the cabin. I'd pack a sandwich, bring a folding chair, and sit by the water for hours. I didn't catch much, but I didn't care. I wasn't there for that. I'd read a lot, took naps, cooked beans and rice on the propane stove. Once or twice, I saw deer in the distance, and one morning I spotted a black bear, just lumbering across the path, not bothering with me. I kept my food sealed tight after that. By the second week, though, things started to shift a little. Not anything big, not at first. Just small details that didn't feel right. The first thing was the footprints. There was a clearing out behind the cabin, maybe 30 feet from the back door. I used it as a spot to dump compost and trash. One morning, I walked out there with a bucket of food scraps, and I saw boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. These were deep, with a square heel and a thick tread. I wore sneakers or sandals every day, nothing that would leave a print like that. And these were fresh, pressed into the damp earth like someone had walked through just that morning. I looked around, called out once, but of course there was no answer. Just trees and brush. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the property. There wasn't any fence or anything, but I figured maybe someone had been hiking. It was public land past a certain point. Still, it didn't sit right. I didn't sleep well that night. The next few days were quiet again. I tried to forget about it. Then on Thursday, I went to grab one of my tackle boxes from under the porch, and it was gone. I was sure I'd put it back. I remembered placing it beside the bucket with extra fishing line. Now it was just gone. I thought maybe I'd left it by the stream, but when I walked down there, nothing. I checked all around the cabin. Nothing. I kept my truck locked, but I checked that too. Nothing. Now I started to get that feeling. You know, the one. Like someone's been in your space. Like the air has changed and doesn't belong to you anymore. That night, I sat up late, reading on the porch with a lantern. I kept listening for sounds, for movement. A few times I thought I heard something. Sticks cracking, a low shuffle in the trees, but it could have been anything. Could have been a raccoon. Could have been the wind. But the next morning, I found something that made it all feel real. On the window outside the bedroom, on the outside, was a greasy handprint. Full-sized, right in the center of the glass. Like someone had leaned forward and pressed their palm flat against it. 5 fingers, smudged with dirt or oil. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I hadn't seen or heard a single car since I got there. No visitors, no neighbors, no reason anyone would be out here. It was too far, too hidden. Whoever left that handprint knew I was here. They'd come up close to the cabin. They'd looked inside. That day, I cleaned the rifle I'd brought. I'd only used it once for target practice, but now I loaded it and kept it beside the bed. I didn't sleep well again. Every sound outside made me sit up, heart pounding. 3 days passed. Nothing happened. I didn't go to the stream anymore. I stayed close. I kept the doors locked. I peered out the windows before stepping outside. I told myself maybe it was just a hiker, some random weirdo passing through. But then came the worst night. It started like any other. I ate dinner, just beans and eggs, and sat on the porch until the sun dipped low. The light in the woods went orange, then blue, then gone. I went inside and locked the door. I turned off all the lights and laid in bed with the rifle beside me. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. No loud sound, no dream. Just that sharp, silent kind of waking where your brain tells you something's wrong. The window was open. I never opened that window. It was small, hard to crank, and didn't have a screen. But now it was cracked open an inch, just wide enough to let in cold air. I sat up in bed and stared. The moonlight made the room glow pale blue. My heart thudded like a drum. And then I saw movement. A shape just outside. Not a face, not a clear figure. Just something there, low and hunched. Like someone crouched beside the cabin wall, just beneath the window. Waiting, listening. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just sat frozen, staring at that inch of black space between the window and the frame. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. After what felt like forever, the shape shifted. It stood slowly, like someone pushing up from a crouch. And then it moved away. I didn't hear it walk. I just saw the shadow slide out of view. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink, I think. I sat up until morning, holding the rifle, eyes locked on that window. When it was finally light, I walked outside. There were more prints in the dirt now. Not just in the clearing, *right* outside the window. Deep and messy, same boots. And on the side of the cabin, scratched into the wood with something sharp, was a line. Just a single horizontal gouge, as long as my arm, carved low into the wall. Like someone had dragged a knife or a key straight across it. That was it for me. I packed that day, shoved everything into the truck as fast as I could. I didn't care about cleaning. I didn't care about the trash. I just needed to get out. I didn't even go back to lock the door. I drove until I hit the main road, then farther until I had bars on my phone again. I pulled over in front of a gas station and just sat there, letting my hands stop shaking. I didn't report it. What could I say? That someone was near my cabin? That I saw a shape in the night? There was no proof, no faces, no names. Just tracks and a handprint. I never went back. Later, I told Rick what happened. He said the owner of the cabin didn't want to hear about it. Said the guy was old, didn't care, probably wouldn't even fix the window. That was 6 years ago. Sometimes I still dream about that window, about the inch of open space and the shape crouched outside. I still lock every door and check every window, even if I'm just going to bed in my apartment. I wanted quiet. I wanted to get away from people. But the thing is, you never really know who's out there. You think It was late September when I decided to take that camping trip. The kind of trip that was meant to be peaceful, a chance to disconnect from everything for a few days. No phones, no distractions. Just me, nature, and the simple quiet of the woods. I was 28, living in a small town in Michigan, working a desk job that had started to wear on me. I'd been to this forest before, but only on day hikes. This time, I wanted to camp. I wanted to experience the full thing. Setting up a tent, cooking over a fire, and being out there in the quiet. Maybe I needed a break more than I realized, or maybe I was just tired of the noise of everyday life. Either way, I packed my gear, got in my truck, and drove a couple of hours to a place called Big Pines National Forest. I pulled up to the parking lot at the trailhead around mid-afternoon. It was colder than I expected for September, and the trees were starting to turn, their leaves showing off a little early autumn color. I could already smell the earthy, pine-scented air that I loved so much, and for a moment, I felt at peace. The trail I was heading to was a loop that stretched about 8 miles, and the campsite was right on a small creek. It was a popular spot for people who wanted to get away but still be close enough to civilization if they needed it. I knew it wouldn't be completely isolated, but that didn't matter. I was looking for solitude, not total isolation. I started the hike around 4 p.m., trying to pace myself. The trail wasn't difficult, mostly flat, and it wasn't long before I was deep into the forest, the canopy of trees overhead blocking out most of the sun. The air was cool but not cold, and with every step, I felt more and more disconnected from the hustle and bustle of the world. This was exactly what I needed. By the time I reached the campsite around 6 p.m., the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The spot was perfect, an open clearing next to the creek, with a fire ring already in place and a few logs set up as benches. I dropped my backpack on the ground, relieved to have made it. I set up my tent first, securing the stakes into the damp earth. then gathered some firewood from the pile nearby. The creek babbled gently behind me, and the sound was soothing. I started the fire without much trouble, something I was familiar with from my occasional camping trips. The flames crackled and popped, and the warmth spread through the cool evening air. I took out a can of chili and heated it over the fire, the smell of food mixing with the pine scent around me. As I sat there, eating and watching the fire dance, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. This was exactly what I had needed. It wasn't long before the sun finally set, leaving the forest in a twilight haze. The stars began to appear one by one, slowly filling the sky with their cold, distant light. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows around the clearing. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft rustling of the leaves in the trees. I felt completely alone, but not in a bad way, just alone enough to be free of everything that had been weighing on my mind. As the night deepened, I started to feel that familiar sense of unease that sometimes comes with being out in the wilderness. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but more like a heightened awareness. The forest had a life of its own, and while it was beautiful, it also reminded you that you were a visitor here. This wasn't home, and the longer you stayed, the more you realized how small and fragile you were in comparison to the world around you. I tossed another log on the fire, and as the flames flared up, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the clearing. It was quick, almost too quick to register, but I definitely saw it. Just a flash of movement, like something had darted between the trees. It wasn't a bear. I knew what they looked like from past encounters. This was smaller, more like a person's shape, but moving at a pace that seemed too fast for a human. I froze, watching the spot where I thought I saw it, but nothing else moved. The shadows played tricks in the firelight, and after a minute, I convinced myself it was nothing more than the wind shifting through the branches. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was one of those instincts you can't quite explain, like the hairs on the back of your neck standing up when you feel someone watching you. I couldn't decide if it was just my imagination or something more. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe the darkness, but whatever it was, I started to feel more aware of every noise around me. The wind, the crackling fire, the occasional snap of a branch. Even the sound of the creek seemed louder now. I finished my dinner quickly and decided to turn in early. The night had a strange energy to it, and I figured a good night's sleep would help clear my head. I slipped into my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and settled in, leaving the fire to burn out on its own. The air inside the tent was cool but not uncomfortable, and soon enough, I drifted off to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the first thing I noticed was the silence. The usual forest noises had stopped. No rustling leaves, no wind, nothing. I lay still, listening, but all I could hear was my own breath. It was the kind of silence that made everything feel too quiet. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of footsteps on the ground outside the tent. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, straining to hear more. It wasn't the noise of an animal like a deer or a raccoon. It was too deliberate, too controlled. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I call out? Should I confront whoever was out there? I didn't know if it was a person, but the possibility made my skin crawl. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise, and switched it on. The beam of light flickered in the dark, casting shadows inside the tent. Another crunch, this time closer. I froze, holding my breath again, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped, and for what felt like an eternity, everything was still. Too still. I couldn't move. I didn't know if I was being watched or if I was just overthinking it, but every instinct I had told me that something wasn't right. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, I heard a voice. It was faint, muffled by the fabric of the tent, but it sounded like it was coming from the other side. I held my breath again. The voice sounded strange, almost like it was whispering, but not to me. It wasn't a normal whisper, though. It felt off, like it was trying to stay hidden. The voice faded away, and the footsteps started again. This time retreating, moving further back into the woods. My pulse was racing now. Whoever or whatever had been out there was leaving, but the dread didn't leave with it. I waited in silence for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. The clearing was empty. The fire had burned down to embers, and everything was still. Too still. I checked my gear, checked the perimeter, but I couldn't find anything. No signs of anyone or anything having been there, just the normal sounds of the forest slowly creeping back in. I didn't know what had happened, but whatever it was gone. I stayed up the rest of the night, too unsettled to sleep, keeping the fire going and the flashlight close. When morning finally came, I packed up my things quickly. The sun was up, the forest was quiet again, and I felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. I had no idea who or what had been out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back here again. I hiked out of the woods as quickly as I could, my heart still racing. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I drove away without a second thought. The woods now a memory I'd never shake. I was 32 the summer I decided to go camping alone in the Lake District. It wasn't something I planned far in advance. I just quit a job I hated, ended a long-term relationship, and felt this pressure building inside me. Like I needed to be away from noise, people, expectations, somewhere I could just breathe. So, I packed up my gear, loaded my old Renault Clio, and drove north from my flat in Birmingham, with only a rough idea of where I was heading. I didn't tell many people I was going, just left a message with my younger brother, told him I'd be out of signal for a few days. That was it. The weather was decent for late August, overcast, cool, but dry. I wasn't after sunshine anyway. I was after silence. After about 6 hours of driving, stopping once to fuel up and get a sandwich, I reached Windermere. I'd been there once as a kid on a family trip, but didn't remember much besides boat rides and fudge shops. I didn't stick around in town. I kept going, further along a narrow road that wrapped around the lake, then took a sidetrack that led up into a wooded slope. I'd read somewhere online that wild camping was tolerated as long as you were respectful. Keep away from farms, clean up after yourself, don't make fires. That suited me fine. By early evening, I found a spot that felt right. It wasn't far from the lake, but just high enough to give me a bit of a view through the trees. The area was a mix of pine and birch, with the ground covered in thick moss and old needles. There was no one else around. I pitched my tent on a slight rise where the ground was dry and flat, laid out my sleeping bag, and set up a little portable gas stove to heat up some tin stew. The air was cool, but not cold, and I remember feeling a kind of deep relief as I sat there eating from the can, just hearing the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. That first night passed quietly. I didn't sleep great, but that was usual for the first night out. Every rustle outside the tent makes your ears perk up. Around midnight, I heard something. Maybe a badger or a fox moving nearby, but nothing came close. It wasn't frightening, just part of being out there. I drifted off sometime after 1 a.m. and woke up to pale light creeping through the tent fabric. The second day, I hiked around without any clear plan. There was a small trail running east from where I'd camped, so I followed that for a few hours. It led through thick woods and eventually opened up into a clearing with views of the fells. I didn't see a single person all day. I took a lot of photos, moss-covered trees, weird fungi, some old stone wall half swallowed by the forest. I'd packed sandwiches and fruit, so I ate while sitting on a stump, just watching the trees. Something about the quiet made everything feel heavier. Not in a bad way, just more real. I headed back to camp around 4, with enough daylight to get a small pot of tea going on the stove. The only thing that nagged at me a bit was that I had this odd feeling I wasn't totally alone. I hadn't heard or seen anyone, but once or twice while walking, I'd stopped because I thought I heard footsteps behind me. Always faint, always stopping when I stopped. But then again, the woods are full of weird echoes. I went to bed early that night, right after the sun went down. I remember listening to a podcast on my phone, something about missing hikers in Canada. It was a dumb idea. I turned it off halfway through because it was messing with my head. Around 10, the forest outside started to really come alive. Crickets, some owls, and other noises I couldn't place. I zipped up the tent, tucked into my sleeping bag, and tried to calm my mind. Somewhere around 1:30 in the morning, I woke up. It wasn't a dream or needing the toilet. It was that full body kind of wake up that happens when your brain decides something isn't right. I stayed still, listening. At first, I heard nothing but the wind moving through the canopy. Then, faintly, I heard what sounded like leaves crunching. Slow, measured, like footsteps, human ones, not animals scurrying. These were heavier, deliberate, maybe 30 or 40 feet from the tent. I held my breath. They stopped. For maybe a minute, maybe more. I stayed frozen, staring up at the roof of the tent. I was sure I was alone out there. Who the hell would be walking through the woods in the middle of the night? There were no proper trails around here, no campgrounds. The nearest car park was a couple miles away. My tent was camouflaged green. It would have been hard to spot unless someone already knew where it was. I kept lying there, barely breathing. Then the sound started again. Just a few steps, then nothing. I sat up as quietly as I could and reached for the small hatchet I'd brought along. It was more for chopping kindling, but in that moment it felt like the only thing I had. I unzipped the tent a few inches, slowly, trying not to make noise, and looked out. Nothing. Pitch black except for the faint outline of trees under the moonlight. The crunching had stopped. I stayed like that for over an hour, just listening. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been a deer, maybe a badger. I zipped the tent closed again and lay down, gripping the hatchet tight. I woke up to birdsong and pale light. Everything looked peaceful again, but that feeling didn't go away. I checked the area around the tent. Nothing looked disturbed, no prints in the moss, but still I couldn't shake the feeling. I boiled some water for tea, but I didn't feel hungry. Every time I looked at the tree line, I expected to see someone watching. The woods felt different that morning, like they were holding their breath. I decided I'd pack up and head back down to the car, maybe drive to a proper campsite, one with people. I started breaking down the tent and stowing my gear, trying not to rush but definitely moving faster than normal. I was about halfway done when I saw something caught on a branch about 20 feet from the edge of the clearing. It was a small plastic wrapper, bright red, some sort of candy wrapper, not mine. I walked over to it. It was wedged into a split branch about shoulder height. I took it and turned it over in my hand. The back was faded, but I could see a best before date from the previous year. It wasn't new, but it wasn't old enough to have just blown in from a storm. Someone had to have left it there, and the way it was caught, almost neatly slotted into the branch, it didn't look like the wind had done that. I kept packing, quicker now. That knot in my stomach had returned. I had this image in my head of someone watching me pack up, hiding behind a tree just out of sight. I didn't see or hear anything else, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footsteps from the night before. I was just finishing up when I noticed something else. Along the edge of the clearing, maybe 10 feet from where I'd set up the tent, the moss had been scraped up. A long, narrow line, like someone had dragged something heavy, or maybe a stick. It led from the tree line to a spot not far from my stove setup. I left then, didn't even bother with a final check. I stuffed the last of my gear into the pack, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking. No music.
No distractions.
Just walking fast down the way I'd come. I didn't stop to take photos or admire the view. I just wanted out. Took me over an hour to get back to the car. When I got there, I found something else that stopped me cold. The driver's side mirror was tilted inwards. I never do that. I always leave it positioned so I can just hop in and go. It was a small thing. Maybe a branch hit it, maybe an animal bumped it. But it felt like someone had been there. I drove the whole way back to Birmingham without stopping, except once for fuel. I didn't sleep properly for days after. I kept checking my windows at night, kept thinking about those footsteps, that wrapper, the scrape in the moss. I never reported anything. What would I have said? No one threatened me. Nothing was stolen. There was no proof of anything. Just a growing feeling that someone had been watching me. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who maybe had been in those woods longer than I had. I haven't been camping alone since. I still go hiking, still get out into the woods, but I stick to places where there are other people. Places with cameras and toilets and signs telling you where to go. Because the truth is, the scariest thing out there isn't ghosts or monsters. It's people. People who live in the margins, who don't follow the same rules, who might see someone like me, alone and quiet in the woods, as an opportunity. And if I hadn't woken up that night, if I hadn't listened, if I hadn't left when I did, I don't like to think about how close I might have come to finding out exactly what kind of person that was. I was 32 when I rented that cabin. It was early November 2019. I had just quit my job at a roofing company in Allentown, Pennsylvania, after a stupid argument with the supervisor. He blamed me for damage on a site I wasn't even on. I'd been dealing with that kind of crap for years, and that day something inside just gave out. I tossed my hard hat on the truck seat, clocked out, and never went back. I didn't really have a plan. I had maybe $5,000 saved up, no wife or kids to worry about. My brother tried to talk me into staying with him and his girlfriend in Lancaster for a while, but I didn't want to be a burden or sit on a couch feeling useless. I needed to get out, be alone, clear my head. So I searched online for cabins for rent. Not resorts or anything fancy, just a plain, private place out in the sticks. I ended up finding a listing on some forum. It wasn't even a proper website. This guy named Ron posted that he had an old hunting cabin near Clinton County, about 20 miles outside of a town called Renovo, and he was willing to rent it out for cheap during the off-season. It was rough, no running water, no electricity, just a generator and a propane heater. No cell service either, but I liked the idea of being cut off from everything. I messaged him, wired half the money up front, and got directions to the place. He mailed me an old-fashioned paper map with a hand-drawn route marked in red. That should have been the first red flag. The drive up was beautiful. 2-lane roads winding through hills and dead forests. Leaves were mostly off the trees, and everything had that quiet, gray tone. The kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. Took me almost 4 hours from Allentown. I followed Ron's map exactly, and I found the dirt path he marked after a long stretch past a gas station that looked closed for the season. The dirt road was narrow and full of potholes. My old Ford Ranger shook like hell going up. After about 15 minutes of crawling through the woods, I saw it, the cabin. It was set in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. No signs of other people, no tire tracks except mine. The roof sagged in the middle. The siding was dark wood, cracked in places, and there was a small chimney poking out of one side. A rusted metal shed sat about 30 feet to the right. There was no lock on the cabin door, just a wooden bar you could slide into place from the inside. I stepped in and looked around. There was one room, a cot, a small table with 2 folding chairs, a wood stove in the corner, and some old shelves stacked with canned food and matches. A 5-gallon water jug sat by the wall. Everything smelled like dust and mildew. I unpacked my stuff, just some clothes, a few tools, a bunch of bottled water, and a cooler with food, and set up the cot. There was a little solar lantern on the table, and the generator sat outside behind the shed. I didn't turn it on. I didn't need power just yet. I lit a couple candles, opened a can of beans, and ate straight from the tin. That first night was quiet. The wind rattled the windows now and then, and I heard a few branches snap in the woods, but nothing that really got to me. I didn't sleep great, but I wasn't scared either. Just felt off. I figured it was the isolation. I told myself I'd feel better in the morning. The next few days were mostly the same. I chopped some firewood from a fallen tree nearby, stacked it against the side of the cabin. I spent hours walking through the woods, just trying to kill time. There were no trails, and the forest felt dense and untouched. Every now and then I'd see animal tracks or droppings, but I never spotted anything larger than a squirrel. The weirdness started around day 4. I had gone about a mile into the woods to check out a small stream I found on the second day. I liked the sound of running water. It gave the place a bit of life. But that day, the stream was gone. I swear it. The rocks were there, still wet, but no water. It was like someone turned off a faucet. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty bed, trying to figure it out. Maybe it was seasonal, I thought. Maybe it dried up sometimes. I shrugged it off and headed back to the cabin. But I couldn't find the path. I had been using broken twigs and small stacks of rocks to mark my way back, but they were gone. I retraced my steps, or tried to, but nothing looked right. Every direction looked the same, just trees and more trees. I didn't panic at first. I had a compass in my jacket. I pulled it out, turned west like I always did, and walked for about an hour. When I saw the cabin again, I almost cried. Not from fear, just relief. I didn't like how fast that turned into something deeper, something colder. That night, I didn't light any candles. I just lay there on the cot, eyes open, listening. The wind had stopped. Total silence. Not even bugs. Sometime past midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow ones. Not crunching leaves. More like pressing against them. Like someone trying to walk quiet. I sat up, heart pounding, grabbed the hatchet I kept near the cot. I didn't breathe. The steps circled the cabin. One loop, then nothing. I waited an hour before I moved. I pressed my face to the window but saw only black trees. No flashlight, no sounds, just trees. Next morning, I walked the entire perimeter of the cabin. No prints, no broken branches, nothing to prove anyone had been there. I tried to radio for help that day. I had a little emergency CB radio in my truck. I climbed in, tried every channel. Static. I turned on the truck and considered driving out, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared. Maybe I thought I was just getting in my own head. The isolation was messing with me. That night, the generator started by itself. I hadn't touched it in days. It was an old pull-start Honda model. No electric start, no timer. Just suddenly roaring to life behind the shed. I bolted outside with the hatchet. No one there. No footprints. I shut it off and rolled it into the cabin. That thing was heavy, must have been 90 pounds. I locked it inside with me. Next morning, I found all the canned food open and dumped on the floor. Not eaten, just opened and emptied. Clean slices down the side of each tin like someone used a proper opener. My opener was still on the shelf. I packed everything, tossed it all in the truck and started driving down the dirt road. About half a mile in, the path was blocked. A tree had fallen. I got out, checked it. It hadn't rotted or snapped in the wind. It was cut, clean through like with a saw. I hadn't heard any chainsaws or engines. I would have. I backed up, turned around, tried a different route I had seen on the map. It looked promising, just another dirt path heading east. But that ended in a ditch. No way around it. I went back to the cabin. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the table, lantern on, hatchet in one hand, flashlight in the other. I stared at the door. Nothing happened. No steps, no sounds. Just waiting. By the 6th day, I had started writing things down. Notes, times, locations. Trying to make sense of it. I found myself checking the same parts of the forest again and again. I left markings, deep ones. Chipped bark, tied bits of shirt fabric. Every time I walked back, they were gone. Like the woods were scrubbing themselves clean. I was running out of food. Only a few bottles of water left. I stopped trusting the jug in the cabin. The water tasted weird, like plastic and dirt. I thought about boiling it, but the stove wouldn't stay lit. It would catch, then die out, even with fresh kindling and paper. Day 8, I found footprints, barefoot, human, small, almost child-sized, leading from the shed to the tree line. I followed them for 100 feet. Then they vanished, not like someone turned around, just gone. I moved the cot in front of the door that night, slept with the hatchet across my chest. I dreamed of a face watching me from the window, but when I woke up, nothing was there. On day 10, I tried walking straight west again. I made it farther than before, about 3 miles, I think. I climbed a small ridge and saw something in the distance. A clearing and what looked like a road. Real road, asphalt. I ran, sprinting through brush, thorns ripping my pants, branches slapping my face. But when I got to the clearing, it was just more woods. No road, just a shadow playing tricks. I screamed, loud, over and over. My throat felt raw. I didn't care who heard me. I slept in the truck that night, windows up, doors locked. When I woke up, there were smudges on the passenger side window. Handprints, not full ones, just greasy smears like someone leaned against the glass. That morning, the key to the cabin was gone. I had left it in the ignition, nowhere to be found. The door was wide open. Inside, every item was stacked in the center of the room, neatly. My bags, the lantern, the stove, even the empty cans, like someone had made a little shrine. That broke me. I left everything, grabbed my wallet, My name's Eric. I'm 34 years old, and this happened back in late October 2019. At the time, I was working as a freelance graphic designer, mostly staying home and handling everything online. That kind of freedom let me get away from the city sometimes, especially when things got overwhelming. I'd just come off a string of tight deadline projects, barely sleeping or eating properly, and my head felt like it was full of static. I needed out. So, I rented a cabin in upstate Maine through a small site that specialized in off-grid getaways. It wasn't some luxury Airbnb cabin with Wi-Fi and fancy appliances. It was real old school. Wood stove for heat, no electricity, no plumbing beyond a basic pump for cold water. One room, a small kitchen area, and a loft bed. The place sat near the edge of a forest preserve, with no other homes or cabins for at least 5 or 6 miles. It was exactly what I needed. At least that's what I thought going in. I drove up early in the morning from Boston. The last stretch of the road was narrow and unpaved, more of a gravel trail cutting through thick woods than anything else. The trees were mostly bare, just clinging to a few orange and yellow leaves. It had rained the day before, so the dirt road was slick and soft in places. My little SUV wasn't exactly built for that, but I managed. When I got there, I found the cabin just like the owner had described. Tiny, grayish-brown, built low to the ground, and tucked into a slight clearing that opened up into dense woods. The driveway just kind of ended at the edge of a sloped patch of land where the cabin sat. There was a narrow path off to the right, barely wide enough to walk through, that looked like it led deeper into the forest. I made a mental note to avoid that. Hiking alone out here wasn't the smartest idea. I got the key from under a loose rock near the front door, opened up, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like dry wood and dust. It wasn't dirty, just old. The kind of old where the floorboards creak no matter where you step, and the windows rattle if there's even a light breeze. The place had a sort of rustic charm, and after unloading my bags and lighting a fire in the stove, I felt myself start to relax for the first time in weeks. The first couple of days were uneventful. I'd wake up with the sun, make coffee on the propane burner, and spend hours sitting on the small porch with a blanket over my legs, watching the wind move through the trees. No phone signal, no distractions, just the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the occasional creaking of trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I welcomed it. It was on the 4th day that things started to feel off. I woke up around 6 a.m., just before dawn. The air inside the cabin was freezing, so I got the fire going right away. While I waited for the place to warm up, I stepped outside to take a leak. It had rained again during the night, and everything was damp. The sky was overcast, casting a grayish light over everything. I noticed something strange as I stood on the porch. There were footprints in the mud. Not mine, they were too big and had a different tread pattern than my hiking boots. They came from the direction of the narrow trail, stopped about 10 feet from my porch, then turned and went back the way they came. I stood there for a long time, just staring. The tracks weren't fresh, maybe a few hours old at most, but still, someone had walked right up to my cabin in the middle of the night and left without knocking or announcing themselves. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hunter got turned around? Maybe someone from the preserve came out to check the area? But there was no reason to come that close and then leave without making contact. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I spent the rest of the day inside, keeping busy. I read, jotted some notes in my journal, and made simple meals. But I kept checking the window, glancing toward that trail. I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up to some creak or soft thump outside. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard crunching, like someone walking slowly across wet leaves. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and held my breath. The sound didn't come again, but I stayed awake until the sun came up, just listening. The next morning, I went outside and scanned the area around the cabin. I didn't see anything at first, but when I walked around the back, I found more footprints. Same size, same tread. They circled behind the cabin and stopped about 5 feet from the back wall, then disappeared into the trees. That's when I decided I needed to get out of there. Maybe not that second, but soon. I didn't want to wait until something worse happened. I packed up most of my stuff, loaded the car, and planned to leave the next morning. I'd already paid for the full week, but I didn't care anymore. That night, I kept the fire low so the light wouldn't be visible from outside. I sat in the dark, wide awake, holding the small hatchet the owner had left next to the woodpile. Around 3:30 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. Not fast, not loud, just slow, deliberate steps on wet ground. I turned off the small battery lantern I had on and moved to the window. I couldn't see much through the glass, just the outline of trees and darkness beyond them. But then something moved. A figure, just barely visible. They were standing a few feet from the tree line, not moving, just watching the cabin. My stomach dropped. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark shape. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just stood there, staring through the glass, waiting for them to do something. But they didn't. After what felt like forever, they turned and walked back into the woods. I waited until daylight before I moved. I grabbed my last few things, tossed them into the car, and got out of there. The trail out was even more of a mess after the rain, and I nearly got stuck twice, but I didn't care. I just needed to get back to a place with people. On the way out, I stopped at a small gas station about 20 miles from the cabin. The guy behind the counter looked like he'd been working there his whole life. I asked him casually if there were a lot of hunters in the area. He gave me a strange look and said hunting wasn't allowed anywhere near that stretch of woods. It was a protected zone. I asked if anyone else lived nearby, or if there were rangers or staff who might check on the place. He shook his head and told me the preserve didn't really get visitors. Too remote, he said. Too much wildlife, not enough trails. Most people avoided it. I didn't tell him about the footprints or the figure in the woods. I just nodded, paid for gas, and drove home. It's been years now, and I haven't been back to Maine since. I still don't know who or what that person was. Maybe some drifter living off the grid. Maybe someone hiding out. Or maybe just some local messing with me. I'll never know. But one thing still bothers me. I didn't notice it at first, not until a few weeks later when I was going through the photos I'd taken at the cabin. I'd snapped a picture of the porch on the second day, the morning after I arrived. Just a casual shot of the trees and the path leading off into the woods. When I zoomed in, way in the background, almost hidden behind a tree, was a figure, standing still, watching. I was 29 when I decided to take some time off and go on a solo retreat. Life in Cincinnati had become too much. I was working as a systems analyst at a mid-sized company that had just been acquired, and everything felt like it was falling apart. Layoffs, budget cuts, too many meetings. I was burned out. It was early October 2013. I booked a small, private cabin up in northern Michigan, near a tiny place called Crystal Hill, which wasn't much more than a couple of gas stations, a diner, and a bait shop. The cabin was about 8 miles off the main road, surrounded by woods thick enough to swallow all sound. It belonged to a guy I found through a small travel site. He only rented it out in the fall when his hunting season ended. Said it was best for people who wanted peace and quiet. It didn't have Wi-Fi, barely had cell service, no television. Just a wood stove, a gas heater, a radio, and enough supplies for a couple weeks. I brought a stack of books, my camera, some old trail maps, and a big notebook to write in. The idea was to unplug, recharge, maybe even figure out if I wanted to quit my job entirely. The first 2 days were perfect. Cold air, orange leaves, the kind of silence you can feel in your bones. I chopped wood in the morning, read by the window in the afternoons, and slept for 10 hours at a time. The only noise was the occasional gust of wind and the crunch of squirrels or deer in the underbrush. The cabin was small, just one room with a little kitchen off to the side, a wood stove in the middle, and a cot against the wall. The front had a porch that looked out over a slope of trees. There was no real backyard, just more woods. It was isolated, which was exactly what I wanted. The first strange thing happened on the third night. I'd gone to bed around 10. The stove was burning low, and I'd cracked a window because the heat had gotten dry and stale. I remember waking up because of a sound, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. It was a click, then a sort of dragging sound, like metal on wood. I sat up in bed. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something getting into the firewood I'd stacked by the side of the porch. I didn't go outside. I waited, listened. It stopped after maybe a minute. I told myself it was nothing, just forest noises. Maybe a branch fell. But I left the window closed that time and kept the hatchet I used for firewood inside from then on. The next morning, I went out to check. The woodpile was fine. Nothing disturbed. I walked around the cabin, but didn't see anything odd. I shook it off. The fifth night was colder. I layered up before bed and made sure the fire was good and strong. Around midnight, I woke up again. Same sound, a click, then dragging. But this time it was closer, definitely outside, right outside the cabin wall. I sat still, listening. My heart was pounding in my ears. The dragging went on for maybe 30 seconds, then silence. I didn't hear footsteps, just that weird scrape. In the morning, I found something I didn't expect. Just under the window, the one I'd opened 2 nights before, there were marks in the dirt. Not footprints, more like lines, like someone had dragged a stick or a piece of metal along the ground. It curved around the side of the cabin, disappearing into the woods. That was the first time I started to feel real fear. Not full-on panic, but the kind that sits in your chest and makes you hyper-aware of every creak and crack. I told myself again it was an animal, maybe a porcupine, maybe a coyote dragging something. I didn't let myself think about anything else, but I started keeping the hatchet under the cot. That day, I went hiking along the trail behind the cabin. I needed to clear my head. It was an old trail, barely used and covered in fallen leaves. I walked for maybe an hour, following it until it started looping back. The trees were beautiful. I tried to relax. On the way back, maybe 200 yards from the cabin, I found something strange in the woods. It was a pile of rocks, stacked deliberately, not naturally, about waist-high. In the middle of it was a tin can, crushed flat. Next to it was an old boot, just one. It looked like it had been there a long time. It didn't make sense. There were no other cabins nearby, no campsites, no trash, just this weird little pile, almost like a marker. I took a photo and walked back fast. That night I didn't sleep. The noise came again. Click, drag, click, drag. I sat on the cot with my jacket on and the hatchet across my lap. I didn't look out the window. I didn't move. At 2:43 a.m., there was a knock on the back wall. Not the door, the wall. 3 slow, heavy knocks, like someone using the side of their fist or a piece of wood. Not testing it, just letting me know they were there. Then silence. The next morning, I found another set of drag marks. This time, they came all the way around the cabin and ended at the steps of the front porch. There was no knock on the door, just the back wall. I didn't have cell reception strong enough to call anyone. I tried texting a friend to come pick me up early, but it didn't send. The signal kept cutting out. I stood on the roof of the porch holding the phone above my head for 10 minutes. Nothing. I wanted to leave, but the guy who rented me the cabin had taken the only set of keys to the old truck that came with the place. He said it was an anti-theft thing. If I needed to leave early, I'd have to call him. I couldn't even start the truck without the key fob he had. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to make it obvious I was awake. I kept the inside dark, lay in bed with my boots on, holding the hatchet. No knocks this time, but I heard movement. Something brushing against the front door. Something heavy. Then the sound of metal scraping would again. But this time, it was coming from the roof. Something or someone had climbed on top of the cabin. I stayed completely still. I could hear the creak of the old boards above me, the shifting of weight, then a dull thud, and then nothing. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun rose, I walked around the cabin with my camera. I took photos of everything, the scrape marks, the boot print I found near the back wall, the edge of the roof. On one of the boards, I saw a line of small scratches, like a knife tip had traced it. I packed my stuff. I put everything in a pile by the door and waited. No one came. At noon, I took one of the old trail maps and started walking toward the main road. I had a compass. I figured if I walked fast, I could make it to the road by dark and flag someone down. I didn't want to be in the woods another night. I didn't make it to the road. About 4 miles in, I realized I was being followed. I don't know how long it had been happening. I wasn't making much noise, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. But at some point, I noticed the rhythm of twigs breaking behind me. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't step like that. It was slower, deliberate. I kept walking. I didn't run. I didn't want to show panic. But my hands were shaking. I had the hatchet in one, compass in the other. I kept looking back. At one point, I saw movement between the trees. Just a flash of someone ducking behind a trunk. Human height, pale jacket. That was all I saw. I changed direction, left the trail completely and moved fast through the brush. I tried to make a wide circle back to the cabin. I figured I'd take the truck, keys or not. I'd hotwire it or break a window or something. But when I got back near the cabin, I stopped. The front door was open. I hadn't left it that way. I crouched in the woods for a long time watching. There was no sound, no movement, but something was wrong. I felt it. Eventually, I moved slowly toward the back. I didn't go inside. I climbed into the bed of the truck, broke the back window with the hatchet and climbed in. Found the glove box. No key, of course, but there was a flare gun under the seat. I took it. I waited until nightfall. I sat in the truck with the flare gun in one hand and the hatchet in the other. I didn't go back inside the cabin. I didn't move. Around midnight, I saw movement again. Someone stepped out of the woods. They didn't come close, just stood there near the pile of firewood, watching. I couldn't see their face, just the shape of them. They didn't move for what felt like an hour. Then they walked around to the back of the cabin. I waited, listened. I could hear them on the porch. Then the scraping again, metal on wood, that same sound. I stepped out of the truck and fired the flare gun straight up. The light was blinding in the darkness. It lit up the trees, the side of the cabin, everything. No one was there. I ran. I didn't stop. I ran through the woods in the direction of the road, flare gun in one hand, compass bouncing on my chest. I didn't stop until I hit gravel. Around 3 a.m., a passing truck saw me and picked me up. The man who rented me the cabin said I must have scared off a bear, that the scratches were probably from raccoons, that I'd imagined the rest. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. A week later, police went out to check the property. They found the boot I saw, and they found something else. I had been planning this trip for months. A solo trip to a remote cabin deep in the woods, far from civilization, away from everything. I wanted complete solitude, just me, the trees, and the quiet. I had rented a small hunting cabin, miles away from any roads or towns. It was old but sturdy, with a wood-burning stove, a small bed, and a storage area for supplies. No electricity, no running water, just the basics. The drive to the closest parking area was long, miles of winding dirt roads. I parked in a clearing, locked up my truck, and checked my pack. I had all my gear, food, water, warm clothing, a rifle, and enough supplies for a week. The hike to the cabin was about 5 miles through dense forest, with no marked trails. I had a map and compass, but I had studied the area enough to navigate without much trouble. The first few miles were peaceful. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and the forest smelled of damp earth and pine. The only sounds were my boots crunching on leaves and the distant calls of birds. No signs of people, no signs of anything unusual, just the way I wanted it. When I reached the cabin, it looked just as I expected, small, weathered, isolated. There was a stack of firewood against the side, likely left by the last person who stayed here. The door was locked, just as the owner had said it would be. I pulled out the key, unlocked it, and stepped inside. The air was stale, untouched for weeks, maybe months. Dust covered the wooden floor, and a few cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. I set down my pack, stretched, and started setting up. I checked the small wood stove, making sure it was still in working order. The chimney was clear. I stacked some wood inside, ready for the night. The single window had a wooden shutter that could be latched from the inside. It wasn't much, but it would keep the wind out. By late afternoon, I had settled in. I chopped some more firewood, made a simple meal, and sat outside watching the trees. The silence was almost too much. No distant cars, no voices, just the wind through the branches. It was peaceful, but something about it made me uneasy. That night, I lit a fire, ate, and locked up. The inside of the cabin was warm, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. As I lay in bed, I listened to the woods. At first, just the usual sounds: wind, creaking trees, the occasional rustle in the bushes. But then something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. Too heavy. They stopped just outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. No knocking, no attempt to open the door. Just silence. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep. To first light, I stepped outside. No signs of anything. No footprints. But I knew what I heard. Someone had been there. I spent the day checking the area. I walked a half-mile in each direction, looking for signs of a campsite or another cabin. Nothing. Just endless trees. That evening, I locked up again, kept my rifle close, and waited. Around midnight, the footsteps came back. This time, they circled the cabin. Slow, steady. My heart pounded. I stayed completely still. Then, just as before, they faded into the distance. At sunrise, I packed up. I wasn't going to wait around to see who it was or what they wanted. I left nothing behind, locked up the cabin, and started hiking back. Halfway to my truck, I saw something that stopped me cold. A boot print, fresh, leading away from the direction of the cabin. Someone had been following me. I didn't stop moving. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and drove until I was miles away. I never went back to that cabin. Maybe it was just a hunter. Maybe it wasn't. But I wasn't about to find out. Some places are better left alone. I always loved getting away from everything, just shutting out the world for a few days. That was why I rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from any town, far from people, far from anything. It was supposed to be peaceful, a way to relax and disconnect. But looking back, I wish I had never gone there. The cabin was old but solid. It was a one-room structure with a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a bed pushed against the far wall. The wooden floors creaked under my boots when I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of dust and wood smoke. There was no electricity, just a few old gas lamps hanging from the walls. It was exactly what I was looking for. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked my gear, set up a small fire outside, and made some food. The quiet was almost too much at first. No cars, no voices, just the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. I spent the evening sitting by the fire, eating, watching the sky darken. When the cold started creeping in, I went inside, locked the door, and settled in for the night. I woke up in the middle of the night. Something felt off. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but the air inside the cabin felt different, heavier somehow. I listened for a while, but all I could hear was the wind outside. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, circling the cabin. They were deep, heavy prints, not the light tracks of an animal. Someone had been there, walking around while I slept. I felt a chill run through me. I wasn't alone out here. I spent the rest of the day on edge. I kept checking the tree line, expecting to see someone watching me, but there was no one. I tried to push the fear down, telling myself it was probably just some hunter passing through. Maybe they saw the cabin and got curious. That was possible, right? That night, I locked the door and set a chair against it. I kept my knife next to me, barely sleeping. Every little noise made me jump. The wind against the windows, the crackling of cooling wood. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. I gripped my knife, staying as still as possible. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I could hear breathing, slow and steady. Whoever was out there was standing just on the other side of the wood. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. Minutes passed. Then, just as silently as they had come, the footsteps moved away. I listened until I couldn't hear them anymore. When the sun came up, I packed my things and left without looking back. I never found out who was out there that night. I never went back to that cabin. Some places are meant to be left alone. I decided to go camping alone in a remote forest. I had always loved the quiet, the feeling of being completely disconnected from everything. The forest I chose was about 3 hours from the nearest town, deep in the mountains, and I had done enough research to know that hardly anyone went there. It was perfect, or at least that's what I thought. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, some food, a flashlight, a knife, and other essentials. I had been camping alone before, so I wasn't too worried about it. The plan was simple. Hike to a good spot by a small lake I had found on a map, set up camp, spend the night, and hike back in the morning. The trail was rough and overgrown, but I liked that. It meant fewer people had been through here. The hike was longer than I expected. The path was uneven, and I had to stop several times to catch my breath. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees when I finally reached the lake. It was beautiful, untouched. The water was still, reflecting the deep greens of the forest around it. There was no wind, no sound except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It was peaceful in a way that made you feel small. I set up my tent a few feet from the water, gathered some wood, and got a small fire going. The night air was crisp, and I sat by the fire, eating a sandwich and watching the flames flicker. It was quiet, too quiet. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Usually, you could hear insects, small animals moving through the underbrush, maybe even a distant howl from a coyote. But there was nothing, just silence. I shook it off, convincing myself that it was just because I was in such a remote place. After finishing my meal, I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself into my sleeping bag. The ground was hard, but I was tired from the hike, and sleep came quickly. I woke up in the middle of the night. It wasn't a slow wake-up. I was instantly alert, my heart pounding. Something was outside. I could hear movement, slow, deliberate steps crunching the leaves just beyond my tent. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. I strained to hear more, but there was only silence. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer, but something about the way it moved didn't feel right. It wasn't the quick, skittish movements of a wild animal. It was slow, purposeful. I stayed still, waiting. A long time passed, and I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been nothing and forced myself back to sleep. Morning came, and everything seemed normal again. I unzipped my tent, stepping out into the cool morning air. The forest was still quiet, but the feeling from the night before was gone. I packed up my things, making sure I left no trace behind. Before leaving, I walked down to the lake to splash some water on my face. That's when I saw it. Across the lake, on the opposite shore, there were footprints. Human footprints. They led from the treeline to the water and then stopped. There was no sign of anyone camping over there. No indication that someone had walked away. Just the prints leading to the edge of the water. And then nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been there, watching me, maybe while I slept. I stood there for a long time, staring at those prints, trying to make sense of them. Then, without thinking, I grabbed my bag and started hiking out. I didn't run, but I moved fast. Every so often, I stopped and listened. The silence was heavier now, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The hike back felt longer than the hike in. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like something, or someone, was behind me. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It stayed with me the whole way until I reached my car. I threw my gear into the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away, back on the main road, civilization in sight. I never went back to that forest. I still think about those footprints sometimes, about the silence, about the slow, deliberate steps outside my tent. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I know that someone was out there, and they were watching me. I was looking for a break from my routine, something different from my usual weekends spent indoors. So I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I had been camping before, mostly with friends, but this time I wanted the quiet, the isolation. I wanted to be away from the noise of the city, away from people. I planned everything carefully, packing my gear, making sure I had enough food, and choosing a remote spot deep in the forest. The place I picked was about 3 hours from where I lived. It was a lesser-known camping area, which meant fewer people, maybe none at all. That's what I wanted. I drove most of the way and then hiked the last few miles with my backpack. The path was narrow, surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No sounds of cars, no distant voices, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. After a couple of hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing near a lake. It was perfect. The water was still, reflecting the trees around it. I set up my tent near the edge, just close enough to hear the water but far enough to be safe. The air smelled fresh, the kind of clean scent you only find deep in the woods. As the sun started to set, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. The warmth of the flames felt comforting against the cool evening air. I sat by the fire, enjoying the solitude, watching the sky darken. The stars came out one by one, filling the sky. It was peaceful. I didn't feel scared or uneasy, just relaxed. At some point, I heard rustling in the bushes behind me. I assumed it was an animal. I had read about deer and small critters in the area. I ignored it, but the sound didn't stop. It wasn't the kind of rustling made by the wind or a small animal moving through leaves. It was slower, deliberate. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, scanning the area. Nothing, just darkness and the shapes of trees. I told myself it was nothing and went back to my fire. The noise stopped. It was probably my imagination. The woods can play tricks on you when you're alone. I stayed up for a while longer before deciding to sleep. I put out the fire and got into my tent. The forest was silent now, except for the occasional sound of insects. I closed my eyes, listening to the stillness. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It was pitch black, my tent completely zipped up, but something felt wrong. I lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful, close. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was walking around my tent. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps circled my tent, stopping for long moments before continuing. They weren't heavy, but they weren't light either. Definitely human. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived. My car was parked miles away, and this spot wasn't easy to find. The footsteps stopped directly in front of my tent. Just standing there, I could feel my breath shaking. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then the sound of fabric, someone pressing against my tent. I stayed frozen, gripping my knife so tight my hand ached. Then, after what felt like forever, the pressure disappeared. The footsteps started again, moving away this time, I waited, listening as they faded into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed alert, listening to every sound. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped my tent slowly and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints, no signs of anyone. But I knew what I heard. I packed up my things as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I took down my tent. I didn't bother eating. I just wanted to leave. The hike back felt longer than before. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like someone watching me. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my gear inside and got in, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine, I took one last look at the trail. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the tree line, watching me. Too far to see clearly, but close enough that I knew it was a person. They didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there. I didn't wait. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the main road. I never went back to that place. I don't know who or what was out there with me that night, and I don't want to find out.